April 12, 1945. A date that should have been orderly, prepared, and scripted by one of the most experienced political machines in American history, yet instead unfolded with the chaotic fragility of a government discovering, in real time, just how unprepared it really was. At 5:10 p.m., Harry S. Truman was summoned to the White House. The message was simple, urgent, and offered no explanation. Come immediately. He hurried across the city believing he would receive instructions, updates, perhaps even private briefings for the job he had held for 82 days. But the truth was harsher. Roosevelt had not prepared him for anything. Truman walked into a room and found cabinet members standing somber, shaken. The president was gone. Truman asked if there was anything he could do for Mrs. Roosevelt. She looked at him and answered with words that struck him like a physical blow. "Is there anything we can do for you? You're the one in trouble now." And she was right. He was. Truman took the oath of office less than 3 hours after Roosevelt died. Reporters crowded around him. Flashbulbs burst. His hand trembled slightly as he repeated the words that made him president of a nation at war, with secret weapons he had never been told about, treaty obligations he had never been briefed on, and diplomatic crises he didn't even know existed. Roosevelt had kept Truman outside the door, behind the curtain, and entirely in the dark. Not for days, not for weeks. For the entire time Truman had been vice president. And what it cost America in the months that followed is almost impossible to overstate. To understand the scale of this failure, you have to look at the distance between the myth of Roosevelt's leadership and the reality of his final months. By 1945, Franklin Roosevelt was in declining health, exhausted, gaunt, and carrying not just the burdens of global war, but the weight of secrets so immense that no one else in the American government had full access to them. The Manhattan Project, the negotiations at Yalta, the informal back channels with foreign leaders, the fragile alliances that were already showing cracks. Roosevelt did not share these secrets, not with Congress, not with his cabinet, and certainly not with the man who would succeed him. Truman had been vice president for only 82 days, and in that time Roosevelt met with him exactly twice, both for ceremonial occasions. The most powerful man in the world spent less than 2 hours total preparing the man who would inherit everything. There were advisors who saw the danger. Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, noted in his diary that Roosevelt preferred to keep his cards close to his chest. Others described him as secretive to the point of isolation. But no one imagined he would die before explaining what those cards even were. No one believed the burden would be handed to Truman almost without warning. When Truman entered the Oval Office for the first time as president, he didn't sit down immediately. He stood in silence, absorbing the enormity of what Roosevelt had left behind. It wasn't just a war, it was an unfinished map of the world. Entire continents were shifting. Armies were moving. Agreements had been made with allies and adversaries based on assumptions Truman had never heard. He was about to face decisions that would shape the next half-century, and he had been given no roadmap, no notes, and no preparation. The first briefing he received was about the existence of the atomic bomb. The second briefing was that the bomb wasn't theoretical, it was almost ready. And the third was that the world would never be the same once it was used. All of this within 24 hours. He learned more in a single day than Roosevelt had told him in nearly 3 months. And the weight of that knowledge forced Truman to confront a reality few presidents ever face. He had to step into the presidency not as a partner continuing Roosevelt's work, but as an outsider reconstructing it. He inherited vast responsibilities with almost no context for how they had been managed. What Roosevelt believed would protect the nation, his secrecy, had become its most immediate vulnerability. In the weeks that followed, Truman found himself fumbling through memos, cables, and diplomatic correspondence that revealed problems he didn't even know existed. He learned that Roosevelt had made commitments at Yalta that were ambiguous, risky, and, according to some advisors, already impossible to enforce. He learned that multiple European governments were expecting American guarantees Roosevelt had never clarified. And he learned that some of Roosevelt's closest aides disagreed on what the late president had actually promised in the first place. Decisions that would shape the post-war world had been made without written clarity, and Truman was left to sift through fragments. Cabinet members began arriving in his office with information that should have been given months earlier. The Secretary of State explained the fragile state of negotiations in Europe. The military chiefs briefed Truman on the final stages of the war in the Pacific. Generals who assumed the vice president knew the broader strategy now spoke slowly, carefully, realizing he didn't. Truman listened. He asked questions. And slowly, he began to understand the scope of what Roosevelt had kept from him. The consequences were immediate. The first was credibility. Foreign leaders had grown accustomed to Roosevelt's personal diplomacy, his informal style, his private assurances, his long history with Churchill. Truman had none of it. He stepped onto the world stage suddenly, a man known mostly for domestic politics, and foreign governments weren't sure what to expect. Churchill respected Truman almost immediately, but even he was surprised by how little the new president knew about the state of negotiations. The second consequence was speed. Decisions that normally unfolded over months had to be made in weeks. Should the United States trust certain agreements made at Yalta? Should American troops remain in place until Europe stabilized? What was the long-term vision Roosevelt had left behind? Truman had to make choices without the benefit of Roosevelt's reasoning, personal notes, or long-term plans. The third consequence was authority. Roosevelt had governed with immense personal power. His relationships, his presence, and his aura had held alliances together. When he died, the emotional glue of wartime leadership dissolved almost instantly. Truman wasn't stepping into a stable system. He was stepping into a vacuum. What it cost America in those early days was clarity. Clarity about the end of World War II. Clarity about the boundaries of American responsibility overseas. Clarity about how far the United States was willing to go to shape the post-war world. In private moments, Truman admitted he felt overwhelmed. He told one advisor he felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on him. He wasn't exaggerating. The Oval Office that Roosevelt had occupied for 12 years felt bigger, emptier, and far heavier than Truman had expected. But this story is not simply about the chaos he inherited. It is also about the way Truman responded. He began calling in advisors late into the night. He demanded full briefings on every major issue, from military readiness to diplomatic commitments. He read reports aggressively. He pushed his staff to give him the truth rather than softened summaries. Within the first month, his command style had shifted the entire atmosphere of the West Wing. Departments that had once answered directly to Roosevelt now reported to Truman with a new level of transparency. Some in the administration were relieved. Roosevelt's secrecy had created small islands of knowledge scattered across the government. Truman began stitching them together. Others were uneasy. They feared Truman would reject Roosevelt's legacy. And in some ways, he did. Truman believed in clarity, firm commitments, and honest warnings. In his view, the United States couldn't afford ambiguity. Not anymore. Not with the world on the edge of a geopolitical realignment that would define an entire era. What Roosevelt had kept hidden, Truman brought into the light. He reorganized parts of the executive branch. He demanded consistent reporting structures. He brought his own advisors forward and created decision-making frameworks that were easier to track and harder to distort. And in the months that followed, the cost of Roosevelt's secrecy became even clearer. Truman discovered that several agreements made without his knowledge were already unraveling. Military leaders warned him that timelines set by Roosevelt no longer matched the realities on the ground. Diplomats cautioned that alliances needed stronger commitments than Roosevelt had ever put in writing. Churchill, in particular, pushed Truman to recognize challenges Roosevelt had avoided addressing directly. Bit by bit, Truman began to understand the scale of the void he had inherited, and the urgency with which he needed to fill it. He once joked privately, "I'm trying to find out what the President of the United States is supposed to do." But underneath the humor was a very real frustration. He was piecing together a presidency left unfinished. And yet, over time, Truman did what Roosevelt had not. He built a system that would survive him. The United States did not collapse into confusion. The transition did not fracture the government. Instead, Truman learned faster than anyone expected, stepped into the role with a steady hand, and reshaped American leadership in ways that historians still debate today. But the cost of Roosevelt's silence, those 82 unspoken days, remains one of the most consequential gaps in presidential preparation in American history. And for Truman, that silence became the defining challenge of his early presidency, a reminder that even the most powerful office in the world can be fragile when its secrets are left unshared. In the early weeks of his presidency, Truman often walked the corridors of the White House with a quiet determination that surprised even those who had underestimated him. He was still learning the machinery of global leadership, But he was also beginning to recognize where Roosevelt's silence had left the country exposed. Each morning brought new documents, new cables, and new fragments of a world Roosevelt had kept tightly controlled. Truman read them slowly at first, careful not to miss anything, but the pace quickened, and soon he was absorbing material at a speed that startled his aides. He was building an understanding of global affairs in real time, creating context where none had been given. But the gaps were still there, and some were impossible to ignore. As he met with military leaders, Truman began to grasp how widely Roosevelt had delegated certain wartime decisions, often without coordination across departments. One general would reference an understanding with Roosevelt that no one else had heard of. Another would cite instructions that contradicted what the State Department believed. Truman discovered agreements Roosevelt had made by personal conversation rather than formal documentation, leaving entire strategies dependent on memory, assumption, or interpretation. Foreign diplomats sensed the shift. For years, Roosevelt's charisma had been the engine driving American diplomacy. Now they encountered a leader who came to the table blunt, deliberate, and hungry for clarity. Some found it refreshing. Others found it unsettling. Truman wasn't interested in reassuring anyone with charm. He wanted facts, commitments, and straightforward answers. Churchill noticed this first. In their early exchanges, he saw a man who lacked Roosevelt's ease but carried a firmness that Roosevelt often sidestepped. Truman wasn't playing at friendship or rivalry. He was trying to reconstruct a world order on which he had never been fully briefed. Churchill sensed that Truman would not operate by Roosevelt's style of personal promises. He understood that the new president needed partners who would tell him what Roosevelt never had. Churchill began writing to Truman regularly. His letters were part warning, part guidance, part attempt to ensure his country's survival in a world shifting faster than anyone could comfortably manage. Truman read each message with increasing respect. He might not have had Roosevelt's background in international politics, but he had something Roosevelt's final year lacked: full awareness of how much he didn't know. This humility became Truman's greatest asset. He invited senior military leaders into detailed discussions about postwar planning. He asked the State Department for full briefings on diplomatic negotiations. He demanded comprehensive reports from intelligence agencies still finding their footing. There were nights when the lights in the Oval Office burned long after most staff had gone home. Truman read into the early hours, often alone, determined to catch up to the responsibilities he had been thrust into. But catching up was only the first step. The second was deciding what came next. As May turned into June and June into July, Truman began making decisions that reflected his growing confidence. He pressed advisors for clarity on Europe's political future. He assessed the nation's economic position in the transition from war to peace. He questioned assumptions that had gone unchallenged under Roosevelt's broad authority. Each decision, each briefing, each meeting carried weight. Truman had inherited not just a war, but a world in pieces. The upcoming meeting at Potsdam would be his first major test. The conference, planned before Roosevelt's death, was meant to define the architecture of the post-war world. Truman would sit at the table as the leader of the United States, yet he was still learning about agreements Roosevelt had made with allies overseas. Some of those agreements were clear, others were vague, some contradicted each other. Truman needed to arrive at Potsdam not as a bewildered successor, but as a president capable of shaping the next phase of global stability. He began rehearsing questions he planned to ask. He studied maps and reports. He reviewed transcripts from previous conferences, reading Roosevelt's own language and comparing it to what advisors were now telling him. He wanted to understand not just what Roosevelt had agreed to, but why. Truman sought out men who had worked closest with Roosevelt. Some were cautious, afraid of contradicting what the late president might have intended. Others were candid, perhaps more candid than Roosevelt would have liked. They described a leader whose confidence had grown into secrecy, whose secrecy had eventually become isolation. Roosevelt had governed alone in many ways, intellectually, emotionally, strategically. Truman was left piecing together a past that had never been written down. As Truman prepared for Potsdam, he became increasingly aware of something few presidents ever confront directly. A presidency is not simply passed from one person to another. It is reconstructed, reshaped, and often reinvented every time a new leader steps into the office. Roosevelt had governed through instinct and personality. Truman would govern through structure and clarity. He realized he needed a new way forward, one that survived beyond relationships, beyond charm, beyond private understandings. Truman arrived at Potsdam determined to represent a nation that understood its responsibilities. He stood firm, asked direct questions, and refused to be intimidated by the complexity of what Roosevelt had left behind. He insisted on defining America's position clearly, something Roosevelt often avoided to maintain flexibility. Truman's approach startled some foreign leaders. This was not the Vice President Roosevelt had kept in the shadows. This was a president asserting his authority. And yet, even as he grew more confident, Truman still felt the pressure of what Roosevelt had not shared. He was determined to avoid repeating those mistakes. He wanted future presidents to inherit a clearer system than the one he had walked into. Back in Washington, Truman continued restructuring the flow of information. He reorganized committees, clarified reporting structures, and expected cabinet members to keep him fully informed. His leadership style began to imprint itself onto the government. Gradually, the scattered islands of knowledge Roosevelt had maintained were pulled into alignment, but the cost of Roosevelt's secrecy lingered. For months, Truman dealt with the consequences of commitments he hadn't made and strategies he hadn't shaped. He navigated disagreements between agencies that believed Roosevelt had promised different things. He balanced expectations from allies who assumed he would act as Roosevelt had. He handled domestic pressures from congressional leaders who wanted to know what commitments Roosevelt had made in private. Truman could not turn back time. He could not ask Roosevelt to explain choices or clarify intentions. What he could do was learn faster than anyone thought possible. He could stabilize a government that had relied too heavily on one man, and he could build a presidency that replaced secrecy with structure. The lessons came quickly. He learned that a presidential transition without preparation leaves behind a vulnerable government. He learned that alliances built on personal relationships must eventually be grounded in policy, and he learned that even the most experienced leaders can fail to confront their own limitations. In the months after Roosevelt's death, Truman's approach began to reshape the nation. He insisted on transparency across departments, accountability in decision-making, and coherence in strategy. These changes were not dramatic, they were not loud, but they added up to a fundamental shift in how the executive branch functioned. What Roosevelt had managed through instinct, Truman restored through structure. What Roosevelt had left unwritten, Truman forced into clarity. And what Roosevelt had kept private, Truman brought into the open. He wasn't trying to rewrite Roosevelt's legacy. He was trying to prevent another successor from inheriting what he had. A presidency built on secrets that died with the man who held them. By late summer 1945, Truman was no longer the uncertain figure who had stood in the cabinet room, stunned by the news of Roosevelt's death. He had become the decision-maker Roosevelt never prepared him to be, guiding a nation through the final months of war and into a fragile era that would define generations. Yet even as Truman settled into his role, there remained unanswered questions, decisions Roosevelt made quietly, deals he set in motion, and expectations left floating in diplomatic air. Truman would confront these uncertainties again and again. Some would become defining episodes of American foreign policy. Others would remain buried in the archives of Roosevelt's presidency. But one truth stayed with Truman, shaping every choice he made. A president cannot lead a nation alone. Information must be shared, power must be structured, and responsibility must be prepared for, not inherited blindly. In the years ahead, Truman would face crises far greater than the ones that greeted him in April 1945. But he would face them armed with knowledge Roosevelt had never been given the chance, or perhaps never chosen, to share. The next chapter of Truman's presidency would test everything he had learned in those chaotic early months. Decisions waited. Challenges loomed. And the world would soon see whether the man Roosevelt never prepared was capable of guiding America into its uncertain future without ever looking back. By the time autumn approached in 1945, Truman had come to understand that the presidency he inherited was not merely a continuation of Roosevelt's legacy, it was a reconstruction. Every day brought another piece of information that revealed just how much Roosevelt had kept to himself. And every day, Truman moved with a little more certainty, a little more command over the vast landscape of decisions now under his hand. He learned that leadership wasn't about knowing everything. It was about discovering quickly, adjusting decisively, and admitting when the gaps were too large to ignore. Truman's early months in office were shaped by a constant push to uncover what he did not know. But in doing so, he built a foundation more solid than the one he had been given. The nation had expected disorder when Roosevelt died. Instead, Truman's growing command surprised them. Cabinet members who had once whispered among themselves about his inexperience now found a leader who asked the right questions and demanded precise answers. Diplomats who assumed America would falter without Roosevelt's personal touch discovered a president who valued candor over comfort. It became clear that Truman would not govern by instinct alone. He would govern with structure, accountability, and the insistence that no future president would step into the office as blindly as he had. But even as Truman stabilized the machinery of government, he continued to face the consequences of Roosevelt's silence. Messages arrived from overseas that referenced private conversations Roosevelt had never shared. Foreign ministers wrote letters assuming Truman understood agreements that had only been spoken, never written. Military officers briefed him on operations that carried assumptions rooted entirely in Roosevelt's personal assurances. Truman often sat in his office at night, reviewing papers long after the building had gone quiet. The weight of the presidency was heavy enough. The weight of another man's unfinished work added a burden no briefing could erase. Yet Truman didn't resent Roosevelt. He respected him, admired him, and understood the pressures that had shaped his decisions. Roosevelt had led the nation through economic disaster and global war. His leadership had been extraordinary, but he had also carried his responsibilities alone for too long. The secrecy that had once seemed necessary had become a liability in the final months of his presidency. Truman's challenge was to ensure that liability did not define the future. He called his advisors together and established clearer lines of communication. He restructured committees that had functioned on Roosevelt's personal relationships. He formalized decision-making processes, making them less dependent on individual conversations and more dependent on documented plans. The presidency was slowly transforming into something more transparent, more predictable, and more sustainable. Some historians later argued that Truman was correcting a flaw Roosevelt had never had the luxury of addressing. The pace of war, the pressure of global conflict, and the intensity of Roosevelt's responsibilities had compelled secrecy. Others argued that Roosevelt's confidence had grown so immense that he no longer saw the need to share his reasoning, even with his closest staff. Whatever the explanation, the result was the same. Truman inherited a government that needed rebuilding from within, and he accepted that task with a determination that grew stronger with each passing month. By early 1946, Truman's presidency began to resemble something closer to the system Americans would recognize in the decades to come. His advisors knew their roles, his cabinet understood his expectations. His foreign policy began to take shape not as an extension of Roosevelt, but as Truman's own. He was no longer the unprepared successor standing in the cabinet room, hearing the news of Roosevelt's death for the first time. He was the president shaping America's emergence from the most destructive war in history. The lessons Truman learned in those first months became the blueprint for the remainder of his administration. He insisted that no major initiative move forward without thorough briefings. He demanded that future vice presidents receive regular updates on matters of national importance. He made sure information was shared not only upward to his office, but horizontally across departments. The government Roosevelt had kept close to his chest was now opening, aligning, and learning to function as a cohesive whole. This shift mattered. It mattered because Truman knew firsthand what it meant to inherit a presidency without guidance. He understood the anxiety of stepping into the role without knowing what had already been decided or why. And he knew that the stability of the nation depended on a system that could withstand sudden, unexpected change. Truman's early presidency is often remembered for its decisive moments at Potsdam, its role in concluding the war, and the major foreign policy doctrines that followed in the years ahead. But behind those public decisions was a quieter transformation, one that began in the first chaotic hours after Roosevelt's death, when Truman realized how deeply he had been kept outside the circle of knowledge. His administration became a corrective to that silence. In private letters, Truman sometimes reflected on the strange path that led him to the Oval Office. He never forgot the moment Eleanor Roosevelt told him the news. He never forgot walking into the room where Roosevelt had worked just hours earlier. And he never forgot the sense of isolation that came with discovering how little he had been told. Those memories shaped him. They shaped the way he delegated authority, the way he shared information, and the way he expected his advisors to communicate with one another. Truman made sure that no future president would stand where he once stood, forced to piece together the direction of a nation from scattered notes and late-night briefings. He believed leadership required continuity, and continuity required openness. This belief became a defining characteristic of his presidency, even as he faced challenges that tested the strength of the systems he had built. Truman encountered crises that would have overwhelmed a less prepared leader, but he met them with a clarity he had forged through necessity. His rise to leadership had been abrupt, his preparation had been minimal, but his commitment to understanding, organizing, and strengthening the presidency was unwavering. In the years that followed, Truman's decisions shaped the global order in ways few imagined when he first took the oath of office. He oversaw the end of the war, navigated the fragile aftermath, and laid groundwork that would define American policy long after he left office. His legacy was not just in the doctrines that carried his name, but in the structure he built within the West Wing, structures that allowed future presidents to inherit a more transparent and resilient government. Truman had stepped into the presidency under the most challenging circumstances. He had been left without instruction, without context, and without preparation. But he turned that vulnerability into purpose. He built a system that ensured no one would inherit the office as blindly as he had. He once said that he had done his best, and that anyone who did their best could do no more. His presidency reflected that ethos. He approached the office not as a man seeking greatness, but as a man determined to fulfill the responsibilities he had been handed. And when he left office in 1953, he did so knowing that the system he passed on was stronger than the one he had received. The cost of Roosevelt's silence had been profound. It had complicated wartime decisions, strained diplomatic relationships, and left Truman scrambling for clarity in the earliest days of his leadership. But Truman responded by reshaping the presidency into something more stable, more systematic, and more open. His transformation from an unprepared successor to a confident leader remains one of the most remarkable transitions in American political history. In the end, Truman did not inherit Roosevelt's world. He inherited Roosevelt's unfinished work. And in finishing it, he forged his own legacy, one built not on secrecy, but on structure, clarity, and the belief that the presidency must be bigger than one man. It must be prepared to endure, and it must be prepared to continue, no matter how suddenly the weight of responsibility changes hands. On April 12, 1945, Harry S. Truman became president without warning, but he ensured that no successor would ever confront the same silence again. He entered the White House unprepared. He left it knowing he had reshaped the very office he once feared he could not fill.